Forget what the bards sang and the Hollywood screen spoon-fed you about medieval romance. All chivalry and whispered sweet nothings. The truth, darling, was often far grittier, stickier, and frankly, a lot more humiliating than any moonlit serenade could ever convey. We're talking about a world where consummation wasn't just a legal formality, but sometimes a public spectacle, a brutal assertion of ownership, dripping with sweat, fear, and dubious historical precedents. If you're here for the sanitized versions, you've wandered into the wrong tavern. We're diving headfirst into the putrid, fascinating muck of history's most uncomfortable bedding ceremonies. And hey, if this kind of darkly twisted, historically accurate peek behind the bedroom curtains is your particular poison, let me know what shocks you most in the comments. We're all perverts here, right? Consider, if you will, the notorious droit du seigneur, or Lord's right, that delightful little myth-turned historical whisper. The tale goes that the feudal lord had the prerogative to deflower a bride on her wedding night before her actual husband got his grubby paws on her. Now, before you start foaming at the mouth, direct historical evidence for this as a widespread, legally enforced practice is scant, often rooted in later revolutionary propaganda rather than solid contemporary records. And here's the rub that makes your stomach churn. The idea of it, the fear of it, the power dynamic it represented, that was very real. It wasn't about sex for pleasure, it was about power, raw and unadulterated, the kind that makes a woman's breath catch in her throat and her palms sweat. Imagine the psychological chokehold this notion held over medieval peasants. Your daughter, your sister, your bride, a piece of chattel potentially subject to the whims of a man who owned the very dirt you tilled. The fear alone was a powerful control mechanism, a silent, festering wound in the communal psyche. Even if not physically enacted, the threat of such a monstrous claim lingered like a persistent, unpleasant odor, a reminder of who truly held the reins, who truly had the right to every single inch of your existence, right down to the most intimate folds of your being. This wasn't about love or even lust. It was about dominion, about reinforcing the brutal hierarchy with the ultimate symbol of submission, the body itself. The Lord's potential claim was a constant shadow, an unspoken menace that ensured fealty through sheer, gut-wrenching terror. They called it holy matrimony, but sometimes it felt more like a sacred auction where the purity of the bride was a currency and the Lord held the ultimate bid. You think modern weddings are stressful? Try adding a potential sexual assault by your landowner to the reception checklist. Then there's the more documented, though no less disturbing, practice of public or semi-public consummation, particularly among the nobility. Forget your private boudoirs and discreet fade to blacks. For royal or high-ranking aristocratic couples, the wedding night could be a spectator sport. The bride and groom, after a day of elaborate feasting, heavy drinking, and probably enduring countless lewd jokes from their boisterous guests, would be formally escorted to their bedchamber. And by escorted, I mean practically hauled, often half-dressed, by a raucous procession of nobles, priests, and assorted hangers-on. The entire court, it seemed, was there to witness the grand finale. This wasn't some quaint, charming tradition. It was a bizarre, almost grotesque performance. The point? To ensure the marriage was truly bedded and, more importantly, to verify the bride's virginity. Because heavens forbid a noble lineage be tainted by a less than intact hymen. Imagine the pressure, the sheer crushing weight of expectation under the leering gaze of dozens, if not hundreds, of people. The room would reek of stale wine, sweat, and nervous anticipation. The air, thick with unspoken judgments and prurient curiosity, would press down on the couple like a physical force. It wasn't about intimacy, it was about validation, about property rights, about the purity of a bloodline measured by a single, fragile membrane. Sometimes a bedding ceremony involved literally putting the couple into bed, pulling back the covers, and sometimes, even more disturbingly, leaving them there until some form of evidence could be produced. Yes, proof. Proof of penetration, proof of blood. A stained sheet was the ultimate receipt, the definitive declaration that the transaction was complete, the lineage secured. If no blood appeared, well, things got ugly, fast. Accusations of fraud, shame, and even annulment loomed. This wasn't romance. It was an audit, a bodily inspection performed for the benefit of the lineage, the state, and the ever-present gossiping crowd. The poor bride, often a teenager, was stripped of all privacy, her most vulnerable moment exposed to a curious, cynical public. Her body became a political battleground, a vessel for the continuation of a dynasty, with her personal comfort or feelings utterly disregarded. The husband, too, faced immense pressure to perform, to produce the required evidence under the watchful, judging eyes of his peers. The throb of expectation, the sweat of performance, the fear of failure, all amplified by the collective gaze. This wasn't lovemaking, it was a public duty, a performance of procreation designed to satisfy everyone but the participants. The entire affair reeked of ownership, a primal, possessive ritual wrapped in the guise of sacred union. It was a bizarre, dehumanizing spectacle, a stark reminder that even in the most intimate moments, the grand machinery of power and lineage never truly left the room. And then, once the proof was confirmed, they'd leave the couple alone, presumably to finish the job, or perhaps simply to collapse from the sheer exhaustion of it all. What a way to start a marriage! Beyond the initial deflowering drama, consider the sheer, unadulterated weirdness of medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, that permeated these supposedly sacred acts. Forget fragrant oils and perfumed silks. We're talking about bodies that more often than not smelled vaguely of wood smoke, stale beer, unwashed wool, and whatever lingering effluvia clung to skin that rarely saw a proper bath. Imagine the close proximity, the intimate contact, when both parties hadn't truly immersed themselves in hot water and soap for weeks, sometimes months. The concept of personal freshness, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. You'd get whiffs of rancid butter, perhaps a faint hint of human waste from the chamber pots that sat openly in corners, mingling with the heavy scents of unwashed linen and dog hair. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was a constant, low-level assault on the senses, a pungent reminder of the brutal realities of daily life. The air, thick with the exhalations of unbrushed teeth and the aroma of fermented sweat, would cling to everything. A truly immersive experience, wouldn't you say? Your partner, probably unaccustomed to regular dental care, would offer you a breath that could fell a small animal, mingling with the natural musk of unwashed hair and clothes. And yet this was simply the norm. Lust, in this context, had to overcome a significant olfactory hurdle. It puts a whole new spin on getting close, doesn't it? The sheer audacity of desire to push through such a pervasive, all-encompassing miasma of human effluvia is almost admirable in its tenacity. This wasn't about attraction to a perfectly manicured or scented body. It was a raw, primal urge that transcended the basic sensory indignities. They moaned through it, they throbbed through it, they sweated through it, because that was simply the baseline of existence. The nobility might have had access to some rudimentary bathing, but even then, it was a far cry from modern standards. For the common folk, a dip in a cold river or a quick scrub with a coarse cloth was a luxury, not a routine. So when the wedding night came, it was less about tantalizing perfumes and more about overcoming the accumulated filth of existence. The body was a tool, a vessel for procreation, and its scent was simply its natural state. The idea of cleanliness was a luxury, a concept that only began to truly gain traction centuries later. So spare a thought for those brave souls navigating the thick, pungent realities of their own and their partner's bodily presence, all in the name of duty, lineage, and, perhaps, a fleeting moment of primal connection. The sheets, you can be sure, quickly took on the rank aroma of combined human effort. Now let's pivot slightly to the role of religion, because for medieval people, the church was not just a suggestion, it was the very fabric of their reality, the invisible, ever-present, judgmental eye, peering into every crevice of their lives, including the marital bed. The church's doctrines on sex were, to put it mildly, convoluted. On one hand, procreation was a holy duty, blessed by God, the primary justification for the entire messy business of intercourse. On the other hand, sexual pleasure, anything beyond the bare minimum required for making babies, was generally frowned upon, if not outright condemned, as a sin. It was a tightrope walk between duty and damnation. Imagine trying to navigate that psychological minefield on your wedding night. You're supposed to perform, to consummate, to ensure the continuation of the family line, but God forbid you enjoy it too much. The sin of luxuria, lust, was a constant shadow, a terrifying whisper in the back of one's mind. So were they supposed to have sex, like automatons, mechanical movements devoid of feeling, lest they incur divine wrath? This moral paradox created immense tension. Couples were often advised by priests, sometimes explicitly, about the proper way to engage in marital relations, which almost always meant missionary position, in darkness, and solely for procreative intent. Anything else risked the fires of hell. The idea of Kama Sutra-esque experimentation or even basic foreplay was anathema, the stuff of pagans and harlots. So you had the physical pressures, the public humiliation, and then layered on top of all that, the spiritual weight of potential damnation for enjoying something that was supposed to be a sacred duty. The marriage bed became a battleground, not just for bodies, but for souls, a place where earthly desires clashed violently with divine decree. This wasn't about intimacy, it was about walking a theological tightrope, every moan a potential sin, every throb of pleasure a mark against your soul. The constant fear of sin, the need for confession, the looming spectre of eternal punishment, it bled into every aspect of life, especially the most private. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, managed to turn the act of procreation, a fundamental human drive, into a source of immense guilt and psychological torment. The very act of coupling, intended to bring forth new life, was simultaneously tainted with the possibility of spiritual death. What a joyous celebration of union, wouldn't you agree? It was a psychological prison where even your most primal urges were subject to intense scrutiny and judgment from a supposedly benevolent God. And people wonder why medieval art often looks so grim. It's hard to smile when every pleasurable sensation might be paving your way to perdition. The marriage bed, therefore, was less a place of loving embrace and more a sterile laboratory for the production of heirs, conducted under the stern, unblinking eye of a judgmental deity. Moving away from the specific wedding night horrors, let's wallow a bit in the broader implications of medieval marriage itself, a concept so far removed from our romanticized notions it's almost comical. Marriage was rarely about love. It was a contract, a political alliance, an economic transaction, a way to consolidate power, land, and influence. Daughters were pawns, traded like commodities to secure advantageous unions. Their value was often tied directly to their dowry, the land, money, or goods they brought into the marriage, and their ability to produce heirs, specifically male heirs. A woman's entire existence, her very identity, was often subsumed into her husband's family upon marriage. She became an extension of his lineage, a vessel for its continuation, her desires, her feelings, her personality, utterly secondary if they registered at all. Imagine being a young woman, perhaps barely into your teens, handed over to a stranger, often much older, purely for strategic advantage. Your consent was irrelevant. Your feelings were a nuisance. You were expected to bear children, manage the household, and stay silent. If you failed to produce an heir, especially a male one, you risked public shame, dismissal, or even being sent to a convent, your failure displayed for all to see. The pressure was immense, a constant, gnawing anxiety that permeated every aspect of a woman's life. Her womb was not her own. It belonged to her family, her husband, and ultimately to the continuation of the bloodline. The idea of marrying for love was a bizarre, almost ludicrous concept, reserved for the troubadours' fanciful songs, not the grim realities of medieval life. People married for land, for power, for strategic alliances. The emotional journey for women in these arrangements was less about finding a soulmate and more about navigating a labyrinth of duty, expectation, and often quiet desperation. They might find some modicum of affection over time, but that was a fortunate byproduct, not the primary goal. And, God forbid, she showed any sign of independence or intellect. Her role was to be chaste, obedient, and fertile. Anything else was a deviation, an aberration, a threat to the established order. The medieval world was not interested in her happiness, it was interested in her utility. Her body was a political tool, her womb a strategic asset. What a delightful prospect for marital bliss, eh? It was a bleak reflection of a patriarchal system that reduced women to biological functions and economic assets, stripping them of agency and voice, forcing them into cycles of lust, power, and punishment, all under the guise of sacred union. The medieval worldview was also utterly drenched in superstition, particularly regarding fertility and procreation. Forget modern medical science. Here, every conception, every miscarriage, every live birth was attributed to divine will, demonic interference, or some bizarre folk remedy. People believed in love potions, fertility charms, and curses that could render a woman barren or cause a man to lose his potency. If a couple struggled to conceive, it wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was often seen as a sign of divine disfavor, a punishment for sin, or the result of witchcraft. Women especially bore the brunt of this blame. A barren woman was often viewed with suspicion, sometimes accused of witchcraft, her body seen as defective or cursed. There were rituals, both sanctioned by the church and purely pagan in origin, designed to encourage conception. Pilgrimages to holy sites, prayers to specific saints, touching relics, or even less savory practices involving herbs, animal sacrifices, or obscure incantations. Imagine the pressure to conceive coupled with the complete lack of understanding about reproductive biology. Every menstrual cycle was a source of hope or crushing disappointment. Every ache, every subtle shift in the body was scrutinized for signs of pregnancy. The anxiety must have been immense, a constant throb of fear and longing. If pregnancy did occur, the entire community held its breath, because childbirth was a perilous journey, a dance with death for both mother and child. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, and many women died in childbirth. So, even if the performance of the wedding night was successful, the real ordeal was yet to come. The biological realities were brutal, and the superstitions surrounding them only amplified the fear and desperation. The inability to conceive was not just a personal failing, it was often a social, familial, and even spiritual one, leading to desperate measures and a pervasive sense of inadequacy. The body in this context was not just a vessel for pleasure or even duty, but a mysterious, often terrifying machine, subject to unknown forces and divine whims. The emotional journey through medieval fertility was a roller coaster of hope, crushing disappointment and profound fear, all underscored by a deep sense of powerlessness in the face of the unknown. And then there's the delightful concept of monastic life, which, while seemingly separate from the marriage bed, often intertwined with it in the most perverse ways. For many, entering a convent or monastery wasn't a spiritual calling, it was a societal dumping ground. Unwanted children, illegitimate offspring, or daughters who simply couldn't fetch a good enough dowry were often shunted into religious orders. These were the unmarriageable, the excess, destined to live a life of forced celibacy, their bodies and desires theoretically subjugated to divine will. But human nature, as we know, is a stubborn beast. Monasteries and convents, despite their vows of chastity, were not immune to the primal urges of lust, power, and transgression. The chronicles are littered with tales of illicit affairs, secret children, and all manner of scandalous behavior behind cloistered walls. The very act of denying fundamental human drives often seemed to twist them into more potent, more transgressive forms. The pressure of enforced celibacy could lead to hypocrisy, a stark contrast between outward piety and inner turmoil, or worse, outright abuse of power. Abbots and abbesses, with their absolute authority, sometimes exploited their positions, turning their religious institutions into personal fiefdoms where rules were bent and vows were broken with impunity. The silent suffering of those forced into a life they didn't choose, the slow crawl of suppressed desire, the shame of illicit acts, it's a stark reminder that even the most pious facades can conceal rot. The cloister, ostensibly a haven of spiritual purity, often became a pressure cooker of repressed urges, where the power dynamics were as skewed and brutal as any secular court, perhaps even more so, given the added layer of divine justification. The religious vow of chastity, meant to elevate the spirit, often seemed to ensnare the body in a different kind of trap, leading to quiet desperation, secret sin, and the bleak reality of a life unchosen and often unfulfilled. The emotional triggers here are profound: the public exposure of hypocrisy, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and the cold reality of survival through silence, all within institutions supposedly dedicated to spiritual salvation. Let's not forget the flip side of marital duty, the widespread existence of concubinage and prostitution, often tolerated, sometimes even regulated, as a necessary evil to keep men from disrupting respectable society. While a man might be legally bound to his wife for procreation, his sexual appetites were often indulged elsewhere. Concubines, often women of lower status, could provide sexual companionship without the legal entanglements of marriage. Prostitutes, on the other hand, operated in the shadows, or sometimes in designated stews or brothels, often regulated by town authorities. This wasn't about moral enlightenment, it was about pragmatic control, a release valve for male desire that couldn't be fully contained by the strictures of marriage. The double standard was rampant, blatant, and utterly unchallenged. A man's infidelity, while perhaps frowned upon, rarely carried the same social stigma or severe consequences as a woman's. For a wife, even the suspicion of infidelity could lead to public shaming, disinheritance, or worse. For a man, it was often a quiet indulgence, a natural inclination. The existence of these alternative sexual outlets highlights the immense pressure placed on wives to be chaste, pure, and singularly devoted, while their husbands operated under an entirely different set of rules. It underscores the profound power imbalance, the inherent misogyny woven into the very fabric of medieval society. The shame and humiliation heaped upon the women forced into these roles, the concubine, the prostitute, was immense. Their bodies were for sale or rent, their dignity stripped, their existence a bleak reflection of societal hypocrisy. This wasn't about choice, it was about survival, about navigating a brutal world where female bodies were commodities, and male lust was an undeniable force to be managed, not judged. The emotional journey for these women was one of exploitation, public exposure, and the grinding reality of surviving through silence and submission, often discarded when their utility waned. The sheer brutality of medieval medical practices, especially concerning female health and childbirth, also casts a long, gruesome shadow over the intimate life of medieval couples. Forget your sterile operating rooms and pain medication. Childbirth was a communal affair, often attended by an army of untrained, superstitious women, all armed with their own bizarre remedies and ancient wives' tales. We're talking about unwashed hands, dirty instruments, and a profound lack of understanding about basic anatomy or sanitation. Infections were rampant, leading to fevers, gangrene, and death. If things went wrong during labor, there was little to no intervention beyond prayers and perhaps a few more useless concoctions. Imagine the terror of a woman going into labor, knowing that every contraction could be her last, that she might bleed out, or that her child might be stillborn, or worse, die shortly after birth. The pain, the raw, visceral agony of it would have been immense, compounded by the fear of perishing in a pool of blood and fluids. And if she survived, she might be left with lifelong injuries, fistulas, prolapses, chronic pain, and a body forever altered by the ordeal. There was no recovery in our modern sense. You simply got back to work. The male experience wasn't exactly a walk in the park either, with venereal diseases, though not fully understood, leading to gruesome symptoms and slow, agonizing deaths. The remedies for these maladies often involved things like mercury, bloodletting with leeches, or bizarre herbal poultices, which were often worse than the disease itself. The constant presence of illness, pain, and the spectre of death pervaded the most intimate aspects of life, transforming moments of supposed connection into potential vectors of disease or sources of profound physical trauma. The human body, particularly the female body, was a site of constant vulnerability, a source of both new life and potential demise, subject to a horrifying litany of grotesque medical interventions and a total lack of effective care. The cyclical nature of lust and procreation was inextricably linked to the very real and immediate possibility of extreme physical pain, mutilation, and death. Let's delve into the peculiar eroticism of medieval power dynamics, because nothing quite inflames desire like the absolute right to someone else's body, does it? The medieval hierarchy wasn't just about land and titles. It was intimately tied to access to bodies, especially female bodies. A lord's power was demonstrated not just by the size of his retinue or the strength of his walls, but by his control over the women within his domain. This wasn't necessarily about overt sexual acts, though those certainly occurred. It was about the subtle, pervasive pressure, the implicit threat, the knowledge that a woman's fate, her very dignity, could be irrevocably altered by a powerful man's whim. Consider the right to hospitality, which often meant a lord could demand lodging, food, and sometimes, less explicitly, other comforts from his vassals or peasants. This wasn't always a direct order to provide sexual favors, but the power imbalance created an environment ripe for exploitation. A woman's no carried a heavy price. Her family might suffer, their livelihood jeopardized, their very safety compromised. This was intimacy as control, a chilling reminder that consent, as we understand it, was a foreign concept. The act of offering one's daughter or sister to a more powerful man, often veiled as an honor or gift, was simply a grotesque extension of this power dynamic. The body became a bargaining chip, a token of submission, a means to curry favor or avoid reprisal. The eroticism here is found in the exercise of absolute power, the raw, unbridled ability to take, to demand, to possess, without consequence. It's a dark, twisted form of desire, where the thrill comes from the asymmetry, the subjugation, the utter helplessness of the other. The psychological toll on the victims was immense, leading to a profound sense of shame, public exposure, and the crushing weight of knowing their bodies were not their own. This wasn't about mutual attraction. It was about the brutal realities of a system where some individuals existed purely to satisfy the appetites and reinforce the dominance of others. The occasional graphic detail, when it appears in historical texts, serves only to underline this horrifying reality, stripping away any pretense of romance and exposing the raw, ugly mechanics of power. Now, after all that talk of forced proximity and dubious hygiene, let's turn our jaundiced gaze to the weird rituals surrounding death, which, believe it or not, often intertwined with marital fidelity and the body. Because in a world where life was fleeting and death a constant companion, even the Grim Reaper had a role in the ongoing drama of sex and power. When a spouse died, particularly a noble one, the surviving partner, especially the widow, faced intense scrutiny. Her grief was expected to be public and performative, often involving specific mourning clothes, rituals, and a period of seclusion. But beneath the layers of performative sorrow, there was often an unspoken assessment. How quickly would she remarry? For a widow, especially a wealthy one, her body became a valuable asset once again, a piece of property to be reallocated. If she was too quick to remarry, it could be seen as disrespect to the deceased, or worse, evidence of an unseemly eagerness for carnal delights. If she waited too long, she might be accused of withholding her body, her fertility, from the needs of society or her family's lineage. The societal pressure to remarry to continue producing heirs for a new husband was immense. Her sexuality, even in widowhood, was never truly her own. It was a tool, a resource, always subject to the demands of lineage and property. Imagine the emotional churn, genuine grief mingled with the anxiety of a new marital market, the potential for forced unions, and the public judgment of every move. This was not a time for quiet reflection. It was a transition period where her reproductive capabilities were once again up for grabs. And for the widower, he too faced pressure to secure a new bride quickly, especially if he lacked an heir. But his experience was rarely laced with the same layers of judgment, vulnerability, or bodily scrutiny. The double standard persisted even in the face of death, cementing the idea that a woman's primary function was her reproductive capacity, always. Even the grave couldn't fully release her from this grim reality. The stark reality was that a dead spouse merely cleared the board for a new game of human chess, where bodies were still the primary pieces and lineage the ultimate prize. The shame of being deemed useless or unfit after widowhood, the public exposure of her perceived sexual availability, it's a bleak reflection of how deeply ingrained these power dynamics were, even when one chapter of a woman's life had seemingly ended. Finally, let's wrap this delightful journey through historical sexual misery with a bleak reflection on the cyclical nature of it all. We like to think we're so advanced, so enlightened, so far removed from the crude, brutal realities of the medieval past. We have consent, we have birth control, we have our own problems, but peel back the veneer and you'll find that the core anxieties, the fundamental power dynamics, the raw struggle for dominance through intimacy hasn't entirely vanished. The fear of shame, the pressure to conform, the exploitation of vulnerability, the use of intimacy as a form of control. These aren't relics of a bygone era. They simply wear different clothes now. The medieval wedding night, with its public spectacle, its crude defloration rituals, its pervasive stench of unwashed bodies and unacknowledged fear, was a grotesque mirror to a society obsessed with lineage, property, and patriarchal control. It wasn't about love or desire, it was about ownership, pure and simple. The man owned the land, and by extension he owned the woman who came with it, her body a field to be ploughed for heirs. The woman's emotional journey was a grim progression from curiosity to disgust, amusement at the sheer absurdity, then horror at the implications, culminating in a bleak reflection on her own powerlessness. No hero arcs here, just cycles of lust, power, and punishment endlessly repeating themselves. The historical details might be specific: the leering priests, the unbathed bodies, the fear of eternal damnation for a moment of pleasure, but the underlying mechanisms of control are chillingly familiar. We've merely refined the techniques, made the chains invisible, wrapped them in velvet. So, next time you see a period drama with a romanticized wedding night, remember the filth, the fear, the forced performance, the throb of anxiety, the silent screams, the lingering stench of compliance. Because history, my friends, is rarely as pretty as the movies make it out to be. It's usually much more vulgar, much more painful, and infinitely more unsettling. And that perhaps is the real enduring shame of it all: how little we truly learn, how persistently humanity crawls back to the same dark impulses.